with people basically about generative AI and thinking about generative AI and how it works in higher education. So partly as a result of quite robust discussions we'd had over what to do when students use AI, I wanted to explore how we could use AI as part of the assessment. So with that in mind, what I did was design an assessment where students could use generative AI as part of that assessment. So they were required to produce a report that evaluated the accuracy and reliability of ChatGPT's response to at least 2 of those questions. So this, for context, this was a level 6 or third year option module based on genocide and crimes against humanity. So they had to pick 2 of the 6 questions and basically ask ChatGPT to answer them. And then effectively the main part of the assessment was for them to then go in and evaluate those things and decide whether ChatGPT was right, whether there's any detail missing. And so the response of that basically meant they had to use academic sources to say, yes, ChatGPT is right because Blokes 1984 says this. So it's also a way of trying to get them to use books and journal articles a bit more as well. So the submission in total would have been around 4,500 words, because they had to write 3,000 words in response to the 750 words that they got from ChatGPT. So around between 30 and 50% of the submission would have been generative AI generated. Because this was a relatively small module, it meant that I could get students to send me their draft work if they were on the right lines or not. So what that meant is that I could see their work in progression as well as the final submission. So I told them as well that they had to indicate which text was taken from ChatGPT and which was their own text. So they had to change the font or make it a different colour or something, so they could, and give me a key so I could work out which was theirs and which was ChatGPT. So in terms of the student experience, at this time, which was December, January this year, most students were unfamiliar with ChatGPT and they needed guidance on how to use it. So I demonstrated how they would use it, how to create an account and so on. And this was ChatGPT 3. So there are 2 models of ChatGPT, ChatGPT 3, which is free, ChatGPT 4, which is a paid for subscription service. And there are important distinctions between them, which I'll mention later. There was also a lot of anxiety around using it because of the institutional narrative at that time around the use of generative AI, and that meant particularly that they were worried that we're going to get pulled up for plagiarism or academic integrity offences in some way because they were using ChatGPT. So I needed to do a lot of reassurance that don't worry, it's fine, you're allowed to use ChatGPT as long as you use it in the ways I've indicated on this assessment. In terms of how students found the responses, they tended to find them to be vague, with quite a journalistic style in places as well. And interestingly, a couple of students found sort of basically Holocaust denial type statements. So stuff like there's the debate around the number of victims of the Holocaust, which is very much sort of heading towards Holocaust denial. And it seems to be the reason for that is, going back to the ChatGPT 3.4 debate, is that 3 is free and basically only scrapes from stuff that is freely accessible on the internet. And obviously that includes a load of denial sites as well as sort of more reliable Google Books type things. GPT-4 includes paid for subscriptions, so that's where it can basically access behind paywalls, journal articles, that sort of thing, online books. So that's kind of the difference, and that's where we saw this coming out really, was related to the debate around like this sort of phrasing around the debate about the number of the victims of the Holocaust, which thankfully students did pick up on and say this is problematic. What I did see as well, as far as the students go, was the same issues with traditional plagiarism. So weaker students didn't really filter. So you ask ChatGPT to write 750 words. Some students didn't include that bit, so it just spewed out a load of things. Some students basically just repeated it and said ChatGPT is right, and then just talked about that for a while rather than actually evaluating the response or engaging with the academic sources. So in terms of comparison with a traditional or a non-generative AI submission, those issues were very much still in a sort of in the room. But what I did find was students who struggle with structure, students who struggle with sort of how to write an essay, found it quite useful because they could block it up, which is exactly what we teach them to do anyway. But they had a ready-made structure with which to work. And so some students who did have that sort of structure problem did better than they have done in other essays because of that. I think the thing to bear in mind at this point as well is that ChatGPT has the knowledge that ChatGPT draws on is shaped by a number of different factors. So it's about those who created the AI model in the first place, so the programmers, the information that ChatGPT is drawing on, so hence can draw on denialist statements as well, and the users as well. So in terms of asking the questions, what I did see is weaker students, despite the fact they had the question, weren't able to delineate the bits that were important for their essay and they could evaluate, and the bits that were sort of filler bits that ChatGPT just chucks in. And also the system does have inbuilt biases. So I was looking at some research recently which asked ChatGPT about social media and which social medias were best for different age groups. And it came back with very much Western social media, kind of ignoring these sort of China, Indonesia areas that have different forms of social media. So it's interesting how, because obviously that feeds into who programs ChatGPT, is that that comes out in the response from ChatGPT. So the other thing I was looking at as well was the effectiveness of detection, because we'd had several, I'd say very robust discussions about the reliability of ChatGPT, the detection software on Turnitin. With Turnitin insisting that it's very, very reliable, and colleagues saying, no, it's because it's highlighted like this, we need to deal with it like this. And I was a bit concerned. So I thought, well, let's try it out. Let's see how effective it is. Now, not many institutions actually use Turnitin's detector for AI. And to be honest, that's probably a good thing, because what I found, there were 34 submissions on this module. Of the 34 submissions, 47%, so 16 of them, were identified as 0% AI generated. And that's despite the fact that all of them should have been around 30 to 50% AI generated. Turnitin didn't pick it up in just under half of them. 26% submissions had less than 10% of the submission identified as AI generated. And of the remaining 10 submissions that were there, only one had the generative AI mostly correctly identified. And even then it wasn't perfect, but it was mostly correct. Another two had identified the student's own work that I'd seen in draft form that we'd worked on together as we'd sat together and they'd typed stuff up. So I knew it wasn't generative AI. And in two of the submissions, the title itself was identified as generative AI. So what I found was that none of the submissions at all were wholly correctly identified as generative AI and non-generative AI. And even in the more accurately identified cases, the text before and after the generative text was also identified as generative AI. So this is problematic because up until this, I mean, this is kind of one of the issues, is that up until this point, the university policy was if it's flagged as generative AI, it needs to go through an academic integrity procedure. And that causes lots of stress, both for students and for staff. And I think the main issue I found when using this software is, unlike Turnitin's traditional software, which highlights this came from this journal article or this came from this website. So you can go to the student and say, well, it's correctly copied. I can see you've copied it because it's exactly the same and you've not credited it. You don't have that evidence on generative AI to be able to say that. It just says, oh, it's generative AI, but you've got no evidence. And equally, the student has no evidence that it's, unless they've got previous drafts, which very rare. I don't have previous drafts of my work because I just work on one document and repeatedly edit it. So short of showing the editing time on a document, which is not necessarily accurate anyway, it's very difficult to prove those issues around detection. So that was my concern at this point, is that generative AI detectors are not necessarily accurate. And the whole point of generative AI is that it learns. So you've got these systems that are learning all the time, and so it will become more clever, for want of a better word, at being able to replicate language, because that's what they're designed to do, is replicate and think about how people create text and do it. So the more people use generative AI, the more it's going to pick up on different dialects, different languages. and be able to repeat that. So at some point in the future, I fully expect it to be able to go down to accent level pronunciations and things like that, which will be a nightmare for those of us who have a Yorkshire accent, because there will be no H's in the entire document. So what I found sort of generally on this is that Turnitin detector is not worth the money. So if you're paying for it, tell them to stop. And B, that students were wary of using it because of the institutional narrative, even though I was giving them explicit instructions, you need to use it for this, it's part of the assessment. So I'm going to move on to some reflections and sort of suggestions. And I said these are just initial reflections and suggestions. I may well change my mind. I think, first of all, generative AI is a learning tool, and detection is always going to be a step behind. So this idea that, like we do with traditional plagiarism, old school plagiarism, where they've copied out of a book or a journal article, and we can say you can do that, it's never going to be able to do that. So I think detection is one of those things that comes from partly from experience of being able to read students' work and think this sounds odd in some way, just like people do when they read assessments that you think this sounds copied, and you're not sure, and then you realise that they've used sort of thesauruses to change odd words, and if you change them to a different word, you can find out where they've copied it from. And I think also that the genie is out of the bottle when it comes to generative AI. Generative AI is far more ubiquitous than actually a lot of us realise it, and certainly as much as I realised when I started looking into this. And it's impossible to restrict something if you can't control access. So telling students not to do something, but then not being able to prevent them from doing something is very difficult. So, for example, Microsoft Office 365 uses Copilot, which is their generative AI engined part of Word and all other Office applications. So, and that's ChatGPT-4 enabled and embedded. So you can pay more for the GPT-4, but you will have probably seen it if you've been writing anything in Word, that it comes up with suggestions, and increasingly now I've noticed it comes up with more complex suggestions. So rather than just completing a very normal sentence that you can kind of predict what it's going to do, it's coming up with more complex suggestions now. So Copilot can produce, if you, again, the paid for version, produce a first draft, and you can work on an edit on. So it's basically pretty much ChatGPT in Word format. You've got Copilot and PowerPoint that helps with creations of presentations, adds relevant content from documents that you've already created. Excel can do things in terms of trend analysis and data visualizations. So actually, these AI tools have a lot of real value for us and for our students in being able to use them to our advantage, as long as that is not sort of dishonestly claiming something is yours when it isn't. Word's also got an AI transcription tool that I've used rather amusingly for some interview transcripts. So I'd interviewed a number of people who'd experienced wrongful convictions, one of whom was Paddy Hill from the Birmingham Six. Paddy's agreed that I can use his name at all times. And Paddy is a brilliant human being who has the most prodigious capacity to swear that I've ever met. So the transcript is just littered with swear words. But what I found is that MS Word, if you use the transcript function and upload your sound file, edits those swear words into asterisks. So you get this a document that was just full of asterisks of all these swear words. So I had a merry afternoon putting back in all the swear words on this document to make sure it was accurate speech. But I found that incredibly useful. It saved me so much time. It wasn't particularly accurate. I needed to go through it and edit some things because of accents and things like that. But A, that will develop as it gets more into its model, and B, I would always do that anyway, unless I transcribed it myself just to make sure it was correct. But it saved me countless hours of time transcribing to be able to go back and just read through it and pick out the bits that I needed to and edit the bits that I needed to. So there's a whole range of tools out there that are really valuable. And at the same time, we're telling students, don't use it. It's dangerous, don't use it. Or you can use it, but only in this way, and you've got to declare it. And then at the end of the day, we've still got to assess whether that's a fair use of generative AI or not, which is a really difficult thing to do. And I think there's a real urgent need for AI literacy in higher education, and it can't be achieved by banning the use of generative AI. And I'm absolutely not saying that we should get students to write essays with generative AI and nothing else, but I think we have to be aware that students are likely to use this, if not now, in the future. And part of that is because we know ChatGPT and models, large language models like that, can produce quite realistic but based in complete falsehood claims. Then that's really problematic if we're not teaching them about those things, just as we teach them about the validity of research and peer-reviewed research and where they get their information on. Because if you're anything like me, you will have wrote a million times, don't base your research on an internet search. Think about the quality of your information. It's the same with this. And if they're not aware of the fact that GPT will just make stuff up that sounds quite convincing, and particularly with references as well, we'll put references in if you ask it to occasionally, but it'll just make them up. So there's been cases where ChatGPT has generated a fake citation to a non-existent Washington Post newspaper article to support a claim that an actual professor, a real person, had sexually harassed someone on a trip they never took in a school they never taught at. But if we think about the sort of legal implications of our students going out and think about the employability agenda and things like that, sends out a co-pilot generated response that seems plausible but invites legal jeopardy, or basically makes claims that they cannot substantiate. It's hugely problematic and potentially very damaging to ours and our institutions' reputations. I think there's also very gently a potential future opportunity for using generative AI in assessment. But I will caveat that by saying using it to mark is potentially problematic because of a whole range of things about, I know when I mark, I can pick up when students have used my lecture notes, but even if they've not written what they've written on my lecture notes, I can, right, you've used the structure of my lecture here, you're just kind of padding it in rather than going beyond it. But also I think, it makes wrong assumptions sometimes, so we can't rely on it, but also it can be, it's not going to give that feedback that we do when we know our students. And I think, so there's a program called Grade that argues that it can grade your assessments for you, and that would free up all your time to be an amazing researcher. I don't think that's the answer at this point in time, but I think there'll be potential future opportunities for using generative AI in helping us assess and the way we assess, rather than doing the assessment for us. As well, I think we can use generative AI in class and in assessments, so getting them to use it as part of the assessment like I've done. So I was very fortunate in that the module specification for my module, I deliberately kept very vague. So it just said, as far as the assessment goes, report. So previous to this, I'd got them to write a report on how close the US came to genocide during the Donald Trump administration. And I'd been thinking about changing it anyway, A, because Donald Trump was no longer president, and B, because I'd got really fed up of reading about Donald Trump. So this was a way of changing it anyway. So I think the bonus was my module spec was so vague that it enabled me to change the assessment slightly without having to go through consent for change and all those other hurdles, because it was still a report. It was just a report on how accurate ChatGPT was. But you could ask ChatGPT questions, the seminar questions in class, see where it comes up with, and then ask the students to say, well, is this right? What do you think? Have they missed anything? Pretty much what my assessment did. And that could get some deeper responses out and avoid those awkward silences that we have, or certainly I have in seminars where you ask a question and they all look at anywhere but you, because no one wants to be the one to answer the question. So getting them to engage with ChatGPT might provide them a focus that they could shift away from, it's not them answering the question, it's, well, ChatGPT's wrong and here's why. I think one of the areas that we do need to think about is designing out AI from assessments, because if you've got a standard ongoing compare and contrast question, then that's really easy for ChatGPT to do. That's kind of its function, is that sort of thing. And so I think designing out those types of questions is going to be the way forward when we're not wanting students to use generative AI in their assessments. So I think more use of reflective work, live briefs, or even, dare I say, exams, where they're in person and not online 24-hour exams, because otherwise you've still got the same problem. And I think less reliance on those traditional essays and that traditional format of, you know, compare and contrast or critically analyse. And I was thinking back to many years ago when I did my degree. Of my entire degree is made up of compare and contrast, critically analyse, critically evaluate those questions. So I think, and also usually it's like 8 questions, one on each substantive lecture topic. So it'd be good practice to move away from those anyway, but I think ChatGPT is probably pushing us a little bit more to be able to make those changes more quickly. The downside is, of course, CMA, so Competition and Markets Authority compliance, which as a head of department is one of the things that takes up far too much of my time. Which is, if you're thinking about modifying modules, it's one of the things you've got to bear in mind is that are we giving them something that we've not advertised, in which case you've got to ask them for permission, all the rest of it, to change the assessment. But if you're going through a revalidation or you're thinking of changing in the future, or you've got a very broad mod spec like I did, then thinking about how you could either design it out completely because you don't want to use it, or build it into the assessment in a way that makes the assessment still rigorous and assesses the student knowledge, but gets rid of the issue of students using generative AI problematically. So I think there needs to be a lot of education, both for ourselves, because the problem is that this is such a new area and it's so fast in developing that every time you read something new, and it builds on. But also for students about the use, because I think the main issue at the moment is that, certainly what came out of mine, is that if we start using ChatGPT in our classroom, but we're telling students they can't use it in the essays, it's effectively saying we can use it, but you can't. So we need to think about how our narratives of our assessments and our teaching are linked to those uses of generative AI, because students, I mean, some students are using it, and I think there's been surveys out recently where I think it's up to 25% of students on one class admitted they use generative AI. And some of that might be wholly legitimate. So Grammarly is basically a large language model that helps you structure your work, and I use that. Well, it's embedded on my Outlook and on my Word, so I use it daily when it tells me how to rewrite an email and to stop saying the ways in which. So I think there's that element of it in just kind of being aware of what actually is AI, and also the ethics of using it and where we're using it and how we're using it. And all those sort of really big issues that thankfully I don't have time to go into today. But I think it's an interesting area. It's an area that's not going to go away. So I think it's one of those areas where we really do need to get to grips to it in whatever format we do need. We do need to get to grips with it. It was fun doing it this way. I found it really interesting, both from seeing the students and seeing what students could do with it, but also seeing how generic some of those responses were with ChatGPT. And I've seen other essays where they weren't supposed to use ChatGPT, but they definitely had, because they were very nice essays, but they were very bland and didn't answer the question. And I think that's where my gut feeling around Turnitin's detection system was as well, is that I can detect it far better than Turnitin can, because I've got the benefit of being able to look back for at least second and third years, look back at student previous work and see if there's any sort of difference in language in issues around time and all the rest of it. But also I've got the benefit of knowing this topic relatively well in some cases and really, really well in others, and being able to go, that doesn't sound right. And it's stuff around references particular that I've picked up, where they'll say, they'll give a name and it'll say something like in their groundbreaking study, and I think, well, I've never heard of this. And so I feel like sometimes ChatGPT is gaslighting me, because I'll think, I've never heard of this. And I'll Google it and there won't be any existence. Think, oh, you've used AI. So it's those types of things. I think that's a poor use of AI and we shouldn't encourage that at all. But there are ways we can use generative AI to make our classes more interactive, hopefully, get students thinking about assessments where they have to do it rather than getting someone else to do it, but also thinking about the world of work and where they're going to go to. Because I've used ChatGPT to, I wrote one conference abstract by myself and I got ChatGPT to write another one. And I preferred ChatGPT's, it was better phrased. So I used that one with the obvious tweaks in that. So, but I wrote the paper by myself before anyone starts getting annoyed with me. But it's those types of things where actually, writing policies, generic policies, why can't ChatGPT write them? If it's going to be a generic policy that's going to be reviewed anyway, let's get the bulk of the work done by an automated system that frees us up to do the thinking about the specifics. And that's where the world where our students are going. So I think there's definitely an argument for making that students need to understand ChatGPT, but and large language models like that and generative AI, but they need to understand it in the context of its weaknesses and its strengths as well. So I'll finish up there, and I'll open up for questions, comments, anything like that.